Hey guys, so during the Middle Ages, Rome was spreading its culture all across Northern Europe, and this led to a wonderful and indeed enriching experience of multiculturalism. And, we might think of Europe as one big happy family, but back then, many were against this, specifically the pagan, fundamentalist terrorists.
Really makes you think.
But yeah, I think this is an interesting moment to reflect on multiculturalism, because, we think of Europe as one big happy family, without really paying attention to the fact that for quite a while there, Northern Europe hated Southern Europe, because all of the Roman Christians were immigrating onto their land, and they were being like,
"Hey, this is cultural genocide."
And of course, we can see today that that was just paranoia, because paganism is clearly still celebrated as a legitimate religion, Like, just the other day I had a friend, and he got drunk and went to get a tattoo of some kind of wavy shit on his arm, and apparently that was symbolical. And through this we can see that Christianity and paganism really kind of mixed to a level of assimilation that I don't think we would expect of any culture today. A level of assimilation where paganism basically just vanished inside of Christianity. And knowing this, that's why in 300 AD, the pagans of Northern Europe decided to make Northern Europe great again. Now, I gotta say, I'm sick of saying Northern Europeans. It takes too long to say, and it's not really accurate. The Northern Europeans mostly identified as Goths. And you might think, oh, haha, Goths, there's so much comedy stuff there, and I wrote all these jokes about it, like I had this one joke where it was, it was about, the Romans wanted to convert the Goths from Fall Out Boy to the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So you can see there's a wealth of comedy material there. Now, with talk of, making things great again, you might think, oh, I can think of some modern similarities with that. But I haven't even started. The next thing the Goths did was to build a wall. But unfortunately, the Romans had the best engineering and the best technology, and the Goths really didn't. And, here's a picture of the wall they made. I don't really get it. I think that little mound there is, meant to be the wall. It's I don't know, guys, wow, did something go wrong a little bit? And apparently the Goths were so, primitive that they didn't even build their own wall. They just built atop a wall that the Romans had built, so they were like, hey, we're going to put a wall on a wall that you built, and that'll keep you out. And so the Romans were obviously an unstoppable force. And so that's why, in 370 AD, a fellow rose up as the leader of the Goths, and his name was Athanaric. And his basic idea was, hey, let's slaughter Christians. And so he went out with his army over to a Christian church and brought out this pagan idol and, told everyone that basically they, bow down to the idol or, and apparently 308 people refused to bow down. And in the spirit of one of those inspirational journalists, I'd really like to take a moment to go through some of these victims' names, hopefully without laughing. Filgus, Wericus, Batwin. Now, we can't talk lightly of what Athanaric did. This was a massive massacre of people. But at the same time, we can't make the mistake of putting all the blame on something as simple as an individual. That this was the fault of Athanaric, and if it had been anyone else, things would have been different. Because something we have to admit is that there was a very strong movement within the Goths that was very anti-Roman. And of course this wasn't with all Goths, that there were some Goths who actually sided with the Romans and fought with the Romans, and these people had to convert to Christianity. And something that's really interesting to note is that the main focus of Athanaric's army was actually on these people. So it wasn't about conquering Roman lands and killing Romans and killing outsiders. What Athanaric was doing was actually killing their own people who had converted. Their fellow tribespeople who had betrayed them, in a sense. And this massacre was at a Christian church on Gothic land, and the people killed were Gothic people. And it's interesting that the Goths actually knew a lot about Roman culture, so it wasn't so much of an outsider thing as you might think. In fact, Athanaric's father, Eoric, had actually spent a while living in Rome as part of some way to secure a peace treaty between the tribes and the Romans. And so he lived there for many, many years as a hostage. And in all that time, he had the chance to get exposure to everything Roman, the great architecture, the culture, just the idea of city life. He was exposed to all that. And in terms of those things coming together, he was definitely like, that's going to be a no from me. Eoric came back to his son Athanaric and decided right there and then to bring him up with this very anti-Roman outlook. So we can see that among the Goths, this anti-Roman outlook was very strong and very old. And, in this massacre, I think we can see something very recognizable, and it's that at the baseline of a culture, it will irrationally defend itself, and it will commit unspeakable things if it feels threatened. And it's really important to note that the focus on these attacks was on the feeling of betrayal and this kind of animal distrust of your own people converting and going away. Because if you think about it, Romans enforced the narrative that the pagans were telling each other. And yes, folks, fake news even existed then. But on the other hand, someone within your own tribe converting, that absolutely and instantly just completely invalidates your culture. It's like you're with your friends and you're playing dress up and you made a pillow fort with all these levels. It's got all these cool features and you created a whole world with all this stuff. And then suddenly one of your friends just stands up and is like, "Oi, dude, nah, this is lame, man. Nah, dude, I'm gonna go to the club, man. Go bang some chicks, dude." And suddenly your friends are just left standing there awkwardly holding your pillow, being like, what did he say? Why did he... So you kill that friend and bury him under the pillow fort and never, ever, ever, ever talk about it ever again. And then you go back to playing dress up, being like, "Oh yeah, how about we make a balcony on the pillow fort, and maybe we could put some turrets on it." So that person leaving your group completely invalidated what you were doing. And I think that perfectly shows the level of animal distrust and the want to protect one's habitat that kind of comes into play here. And I think it's really important to talk about, because in this day and age, we've come up with this word nationalism, which somehow takes the blame for everything. And I think what we see here in this event is a really good argument against that, because what they did was horrible, but at the same time, did they do it because of nationalism? I mean, for one thing, these people had no nation. They had no flag. In fact, there was no such thing as the Goths, I mean, this was a group of many, many, tribes, Athanaric's tribe were known as the Thervingian Goths. but this was just one kind of goth, and Athanaric spent most of his life in civil war with the other goth tribes, so it's hardly like this was any kind of really unified people, you know? I mean, the only unification and the only national pride these people could have felt would be, you know, once or twice a year when they come together for some religious festival and, you know, bow to this pagan idol or something, you know? I mean, that's really the only unification between these tribes that anyone could actually call nationalistic. And it's interesting when you start looking at more modern, more obvious examples of atrocities, you know, because we can see Athanaric was mostly focused on his own tribespeople who had converted. And in just the same way, yeah, the Nazis killed foreigners, but at the same time they built this totalitarian government which was focused on spying on themselves. And then consider ISIS, you know? I think it's very interesting to note that Osama bin Laden, as bad a guy as he was, actually would have disagreed with what ISIS is doing. Because Osama bin Laden was all about the far enemy, you know, so fighting the Western Empire off in the distance. Whereas, you know, ISIS and all these little terrorist groups in the Middle East, they're all about the near enemy, you know, so fighting the tribespeople down the street who have converted. Now, am I saying that any of these atrocities are somehow justified? No, I'm not. What I'm saying is that it's clear that throughout history this is something that has happened again and again and again. And if all we can do is attach some moral judgment onto it, where we say that's because of nationalism and nationalism is bad, then we're not really searching for a real enough answer. We're not really looking for something that actually explains why this keeps on happening. And I think to do that, you have to go down to something which isn't as heady and conceptual as nationalism, but down to something which is much more real and animal, and something that really exists in every human's brain. So, yeah guys, I'll leave it there. Check out this video if you want, and I'll see you there. Give it a click.